well, we're supposed to go to Jewish time and maybe go a little, with Mitch's permission, a little longer. Now, as the discussion, as the statements were being made, I noticed some people on the panel who wanted to make responses, so I will call on them on this order, and then maybe there'll be some more time, but maybe not. Rabbi Allouche wanted to respond to something that Mr. Shapira said about the rabbis, characterizing the rabbi's position. Professor Baum wanted to respond to something that Mr. Spirit said about positions on the panel. And then Mr. Pella, you've got to get a preview of the discussion, wants to respond to something that Mr. Spirit said. Then if I can get one or two questions for Rabbi Allouche, who has to leave us to go perform a wedding, then that should maybe bring us up to time for our knowledge. So we'll begin. You can't hear me? No. The first time in my life. Is this not on? Get closer. Okay. All right. It's the only time in my life that I've never been heard. Anyhow, we'll start with, and we can do this in proceeding, I think, with Rabbi Allouche wanted to respond to something that Mr. Shapira has.
Okay, yeah. Just
very briefly, because I'd like to respond to many more comments, but specifically since there was a personal comment, I'll respond. I think it was a misquote. Mr. Shapiro said that it's not realistic, and that if people follow my opinion, that the Palestinians should evaporate, I think that's the word you used, or disappear, and follow the opinion of Meir Kahana. Let me just make it very, very clear. I never said that the Palestinians should disappear. I'm all for the existence of the so-called Palestinians, because I don't believe in that term too, but I am completely for the existence of every single human being on the planet. I also believe that the name of my congregation, Beth Tefillah, stands for what the verse says, Ki beiti beit tefillah yikaveh lechol ha'amim, that this house, referring to the temple, should be a house for all nations, including the so-called Palestinians. I'd also say that I never quoted Meir Kahana. All I did is quote someone that is, I believe, respected by all panelists, is David Ben-Gurion. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Professor Baum wanted to respond to something that Mr. Spirit said. And thank you for keeping it brief, and let's continue to do that.
Can you hear this one better? Yeah. Okay. I want to respond to the last speaker on the panel and say that, first of all, I think none of the previous speakers mentioned changing borders or seeing this as a border dispute. I think many of us spoke about democracy and equal rights. That's a very different thing than a border dispute. I also wanted to say that as he was speaking, I want to just share with you my feeling. I felt really ashamed to be here. I felt it was degrading for all of us, and for me too, to hear these words of utter racism, confusing, and to try and listen to them politely and to give them space here. I think it is terrible that
what words was up?
I think I will explain.
What words did
I will explain. I think that it is degrading for me to sit here before you and state that Palestinians are human beings. And it is degrading for me to say that Palestinians are not Syrians, and what one Syrian leader is not what another Syrian leader would say, and that you cannot put together all Arabs as one. You cannot conflate the entire civilization of Islam into one, which is a different thing, and you definitely cannot equate that with Nazism. I'll finish that one and I have one more remark. Today in Israel, Palestine, there are no Nazis. There are no Nazis there. World War II is over, Nazism is over, thank God, okay? We have a different situation situation. There is no genocide. Nobody even excuses the Israelis of trying to genocide Palestinians. There is something else going on, and unless people are willing to snap out of what they know about the Holocaust and actually look at what is going on the ground, we cannot solve any problems. These are real problems, and these are real people and real people's lives. Now, there are no Palestinians here on the panel, and I vow to you that I will never participate in such a panel again, because I think it is degrading for me to sit here and say Palestinians are human beings. And the last remark about BDS, because the last speaker has also misrepresented this fine movement and said that we are demonizing Israel just like the Nazis did. BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions. This is a call signed on by the entire Palestinian civil society. 170 organizations have signed this call in July 2005. That means women's organizations, youth organizations, Muslims organizations, communist organizations, different parties that never agree with each other on anything. This is part of the Arab Spring. This is part of the democracy movement of the Middle East. We are part of that movement. Think of it not as Israelis versus Palestinians. Think about it as people who are trying to live together and build democratic institutions together, live peacefully together, versus governments, militarists, and demagogues on the other side.
Can you hear me?
Quickly, you want to...
Okay, I want to respond specifically to the claims just made. I did not equate, it's not me that's equating the Palestinians to the Nazis, it's them who aligned themselves with the Nazis. Haj Amin Husseini was an adjunct to Adolf Hitler in World War II, and if no one believes this, you have Google it. She said that the Syrians are not the Palestinians. That's true. They have a myopic view that the whole conflict is about the Palestinians. My point about the Syrians and other Arabs is that Israel doesn't have to deal only with the Palestinians, but Israel has to deal with 250 million Arabs. Her point about World War II being over, I quoted Hassan Nasrallah from last week. I quoted the Iranian president. I quoted Hamas's charter, which is... I quoted Hamas...
Not that far back.
I quoted Hamas's charter, which is current today. This is not about World War II. These things are going on right now.
Thank you. As you keep microphones are sensitive, you have to be close enough but not too close, or you'll get... Now, Mr. Pelham. Any cards?
Yeah, I'm going to have to...
Let's try this. No, just try it there. It doesn't work.
I'll say two brief things. One is also... It's a spear. Sorry,
That's right.
just two issues. I mean, I think if you come to a panel like this, you need to be a little bit more prepared. The knowledge of history is... I said if you come to a panel such as this, you need to be more prepared on the historical side of this issue. Mr. Spear, because your representation of history here is appalling. 1956, 1967 wars were started by Israel. Everybody knows that. But that's one issue. The other issue is bringing up the Nazis. And this is very typical of Israeli apologists. I've seen this in Australia, I've seen this in Europe, and I see this here. Equating a non-violent civil movement with the Nazis. Equating the objections to Israeli policy to the Nazis. And bringing up the suffering of the Jews and the mass murder of Jews by the Nazis to this is shameful. It's shameful and it's reprehensible. It's shameful and it's reprehensible. I think it's important to realize that the Jews in Germany perpetuated no crime. They were innocent victims of a murderous regime. The state of Israel, however, the officers and the soldiers and the politicians and the judicial system participate in crimes against the civilian population daily. And as Jews, I strongly recommend that you bring yourself up to date on these issues. And bringing the whole issue of Nazis onto this is reprehensible.
just a short thing you mentioned, Mr. Spear, you mentioned that we are just maybe not even 5% of the Israeli population. The Israeli population include also about 20% Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. So we are closer to 25, maybe 30%. That's much more when you look at the numbers. And when you look at the rest of the world, we are actually the majority. So the people who are holding those opinions here in this room that are still supporting the apartheid and the occupation and ignoring the fact that it is Palestinian people and even refusing to say Palestinian people, and they say so-called, you are in a minority. The only country in the world that supports the Israeli occupation now out loud and with no any problems is the United States of America. If you do a poll, a survey in the rest of the world, including all the countries, the supporters of the apartheid are in the minority. And I'm just waiting for the day, because it will come, that this apartheid will end like other apartheid ended. And all these people suddenly will start to say, oh, I was always against the apartheid. Just today, if you go to South Africa and you talk to policemen in the street, ask them, did you support the apartheid back then? They said, no, of course not. And that's what will happen to Mr. Spear and to other people in the years to come, because this apartheid is going to end. And with the boycott of West movement, which is a non-violent movement, amazing, happening now in the rest of the world, in Europe, in the United States, in Israel and Palestine, come to see these demonstrations, these non-violent demonstrations, Israelis and Palestinian internationals holding hands and struggling together for peace and justice for everyone. Come to see this thing and start to connect to reality. And this apartheid is going to end sooner or later, and you will have to adjust to a new world where people are free.
Mr. Spear.
We've just heard, you hear me? Hello? We've just heard Israel described as an apartheid state. We heard earlier it described as being engaged in ethnic cleansing, which is just more demonization of Israel. But let me answer those two charges directly. There are almost 2 million Arabs living in Israel. At the time of our independence, there were 800,000. If Israel is involved in ethnic cleansing, why are there still Arabs 50 years later? Why have their numbers grown? Obviously, they haven't been very successful in ethnic cleansing. However, the Palestinian ambassador to the UN said just a few weeks ago that in a Palestinian state, no Jews will be allowed to remain. So while they preach ethnic cleansing, while people say that Jews who have lived in Hebron for 3,000 years will not be allowed to remain there, that Jews who have lived in East Jerusalem for 3,000 years will not be allowed to remain there, they accuse Israel of ethnic cleansing, and they accuse Israel of apartheid. And sometimes I think I'm Alice in Wonderland here. So these are the facts. There are 2 million Arabs in Israel. No one is asking them to leave. The government of Israel has not required them to leave, but Jews are not allowed to live in the Palestinian areas. That's right. That's apartheid
Speaking
on the Arab
from
side.
the audience. Now, we are, you'll have your time with the cards you've written here. Now, we're over time, but I would have one question for Rabbi Allouche before he has to go. And that's Professor Ron, who's the only person who hasn't spoken in the discussion, but would like to say something briefly.
Just kind of, I think that the dynamics of the discussion illustrates my point about the movement of the arguments towards the extreme. And to try to balance that, I would like to ask the panelists at some later round to see what they recognize as the valid moral claims of the other side. So try to not defend your side, but to defend the other side. See what you take to be right on the other side.
Thank you. Now, actually, the question for Rabbi Allouche is somewhat similar. It says, your talk of, quote, recognition of the other. You talk of, quote, recognition of the other. How do you propose that Israel's government recognize the rights of the Palestinian people to exist, as is the rights of Israelis?
I wouldn't equate the two. That wasn't my point. What I would say simply is that there are two major points. You know, the definition of a fool as opposed to the definition of a wise person is that a wise person makes the important important And the trivial, a fool does exactly the opposite, makes the important trivial, and the trivial important, as the Talmud teaches. But I will say that there are two separate points over here. One is the recognition of the existence of our rights, existential rights to Israel, of the fact, as I mentioned, that we have been living there continuously for over 3,000 years, and the haltage, the stoppage immediately of any crime, whether in Arabic so-called territories or not. That I believe is the most important issue. The trivial one, I think as my colleague Levin Spear said, is the technicality of the borders and all of the other little issues. I really believe that the moment the Palestinians will accept us as a true, uncompromising existence, then the rest can be technically and trivially solved.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This brings me to the first phase of today's meeting, but one of the organizers, Barbara Taft, has some very important announcements. Then we will have our Nosh for about a half hour. Then we'll return and I will sort through these many questions I have, and we'll get as many of your questions to the panelists as possible. Barbara.
Sorry about that.